Hello testers! This is a short tutorial about Bayesian Inference, specifically how we are using Bayesian Reasoning to make better decisions when there's uncertainty. Uncertainty is the essence of risk. It's something we deal with every day in flight test. And I've grown particularly fond of using Bayes factors to help make risk assessments. Reasoning with Bayes factors, it's a method that lets you weigh the relative likelihood of different hypotheses based on the available evidence. For example, is the B-21 team ready for first flight? We used a series of Bayes factors during the first flight readiness review to assess our overall confidence that the team was ready for first flight. This tutorial is going to explain the approach to making judgments under uncertainty. We are professional risk managers. We deal with uncertainty every day in flight test. It's what we've been doing for more than 80 years. It's right there in the motto of the Air Force Test Center here at Edwards. Ad in explorata, into the unknown. Flight test is a high-risk business that requires careful technical judgment about system unknowns. We make judgment calls based on incomplete or ambiguous data. In addition to being a systematic approach that lets us weigh the relative likelihood of different hypotheses based on what evidence we have, I found that Bayes factors are useful. They help structure the technical discussion at safety review boards. It gives a systematic way to consider individual pieces of evidence, the factors in Bayes factors, and you get to do it on a case-by-case basis without getting stuck on the overall yes or no call that sometimes gets in the way. So let's dive in. We'll go through the math in more detail in a bit, but in summary, the Bayes factor is the likelihood ratio of pieces of data under two different hypotheses. So if we have data X and hypotheses H0 and H1, then the Bayes factor is the ratio of the probabilities of seeing the data X under those hypotheses or given those hypotheses. H0 could be the hypothesis of an unsafe test. H1 is the hypothesis that our test is safe. The data, the X, could be a build-up test, engineering analysis, even our own judgment based on prior experience. Once we've collected all the Bayes factors, we multiply our prior odds ratio by the Bayes factors to get the posterior odds ratio. We'll go into more detail later, but let me show this in a real world, but a non-flight test example that nicely illustrates the utility of quantifying judgment. This is a story from my time at the U.S. Air Force Academy. A cadet suspected that two of her classmates had cheated on a final exam, having heard them comparing answers to questions during the exam. The Academy takes its honor code quite seriously, and lying, stealing, or cheating are grounds for dismissal. So here's the setup. Let's call our three cadets Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Alice was sitting in front of Bob and Charlie during a final exam. She reported to the instructor that Bob and Charlie had been talking during the exam, and it sounded like they were comparing answers. Bob and Charlie did admit that they were talking, but they denied cheating. They claimed to have been trying to coordinate a ride to the airport after the exam. Eventually, Bob would admit to having cheated off of Charlie, but Charlie claimed that he had no knowledge that Bob had done so. Interestingly, Bob got a better grade. Bob only missed 8 questions compared to Charlie's 13 wrong answers on the exam, which had 50 questions. But of the 8 questions that they missed together, their wrong answers were all the same. So Bob admitted to cheating and started honor probation immediately. Charlie had a previous honor violation. A second honor conviction would likely have resulted in dismissal, so he clearly had an incentive to deny cheating. Ultimately, Charlie was found not guilty at an honor court of his peers. He appealed his academic penalty of 0 on the exam on the basis of the not guilty finding by the honor board. Charlie's appeal came to me as the chair of the engineering division for adjudication. So the judgment I had to make is Charlie a cheater? This was a mass final exam, and I'll outline some of the evidence or factors that I had to consider. Some of the factors exonerate Charlie, others implicate him. We'll use Bayesian reasoning to systematically weigh the factors. So here's the evidence. Alice had observed Bob and Charlie talking. Bob and Charlie admitted to talking, though they claimed to be arranging a ride to the airport. Charlie was found not guilty by an honor board of his peers. Charlie did have a prior honor conviction, honor violation, so he had a clear incentive to lie about cheating. Bob admitted to cheating, so we know that cheating occurred. None of the other students sitting around Alice, Bob, or Charlie said that they'd observed anything suspicious, though they were all friends of Bob and Charlie. There were actually two versions of the exam in the room. Before the exam, the instructor had laid out A versions and B versions, alternating seat by seat, so Bob and Charlie should have had different versions. Someone had switched the order before the exam started, so both Bob and Charlie had the exact same exam. And finally, we can assess the similarity between Bob and Charlie's exams. So we're going to give each piece of data, in this case these 8 pieces of data, a Bayes factor. And so again, the Bayes factor is the likelihood ratio of observing the data under the two opposing assumptions. In other words, what's the probability of observing the data given that Charlie cheated relative to the probability of observing the data given that Charlie is innocent? So for example, in the case of Alice's report, I gave it a Bayes factor of 5 to 1. The probability of Alice reporting Bob and Charlie cheating under the assumption that Charlie's a cheater is 1. If we take eyewitness testimony as generally 80% reliable, then the probability of Alice's report under the assumption that Charlie's innocent is 20% or 1/5. So the overall Bayes factor is 5 to 1. As far as Bob and Charlie's claim to only be arranging a ride to the airport, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and assess equal probability of observing the data, the fact that they were talking, under either hypothesis, so the Bayes factor is 1 to 1. Likewise, here's my judgment on all the other pieces of evidence. I won't walk through the exact detail except for the last one. My judgment accounts for the eroded confidence among cadets and faculty. In the honor system, Charlie's incentive to lie about cheating given his prior honor violation, Bob's admission, and the fact that we know cheating occurred, etc. So for all these factors, these are qualitative judgments. All 70s are qualitative judgments translated into an expectation based on experience and judgment. This is actually one of the benefits, I think, when it comes to safety review boards. It gives us a systematic way to communicate our experience and judgment and have a meaningful conversation as we work around the table trying to reach a consensus. Now, in the case of the data on the exam similarity, we can be more precise and quantitative. 186 students took the final. And this plot is the pairwise combination of every student, every combination of students. So there's a total of more than 17,000 pairs of exams. And we took a dot product of the vectors of the incorrect answers only. And we get a measure of essentially the correlation coefficient between the exams. And you can see that on the heat map here. This 186 by 186 heat map really gives us how similar students are. So in the case of Bob and Charlie's 8, you can see it's kind of right here in the middle of the heat map. Now, we can look at a histogram of this data, and we find that 958 pairs of exams were correlated by 8 or more wrong answers. And then in only 3 cases, including Bob and Charlie, did every single wrong answer correlate perfectly with the other exam. So the probability of observing this perfect correlation of wrong answers under the assumption that Charlie's a cheater is 1. And the probability of observing this data under the assumption that Charlie's innocent is 3 out of 958. Therefore, we assess a Bayes factor of 958 to 3, or well over 300. So this gives an indication of how strong a particular piece of evidence is. And without the exam similarity, we'd only assess that Charlie cheated as around 10%, given a prior probability that 1% that cadets will cheat. But with a prior's odds ratio of 1 to 99, that corresponds to that 1 in 100 cadets, 1% of cadets will be a cheater. And then these 8 Bayes factors multiplied all together, we come to a posterior odds of 11.5, giving a posterior probability that Charlie cheated of 92%. So on the basis of this analysis, I denied Charlie's request and sustained the academic penalty that he had received on the final exam. I hope this example helps you appreciate how useful I find this in forming judgments and for communicating our assessment of uncertainty. Instead of just having to rely on gut instinct or a binary, he cheated, he didn't cheat it, it's safe, it's not safe determination, we can quantify the strength of individual pieces of data in favor of the 2 competing hypotheses and help move forward to a conclusion based on how strong we think things are. So I'm not going to drive the Bayesian inference formula from Bayes' theorem in this video. I'm going to try to create a separate video that walks through the math. It's straightforward, but it would detract from the primary purposes of demonstrating how we use it. So to use Bayes factors directly, you have to express probabilities in terms of odds. The odds of something happening are the ratio, the probability of it happening, to the probability that it doesn't happen. So if we take as an example the roll of a die, the odds of rolling a 6 are 1 to 5 or 5 to 1 against. And it's straightforward to convert back and forth between probability and odds. You just take an odds ratio as probability over that it happening against it not happening, or vice versa, the probability. You could just take the odds ratio and add 1 to the odds ratio to get the overall probability. And the other final step to actually working through the application of this is that you need to establish your prior odds. This is where some people, you'll occasionally come to people that will object to Bayesian inference. Their objection is that your prior odds aren't, they're not objective. They're often subjective is maybe a better way to put it. So the detractors, they'll protest, well, but you just made of those odds. How's that any different? But really, when you think about it, this approach fits with the growing consensus of what probabilities actually are. The literature, the general consensus, to put it very simply, is that probabilities probably don't really exist objectively. Uncertainty is a relationship between us and the outside world. Risk or uncertainty awareness depends on our knowledge and subjective perspective. So, for example, if I were to flip a coin and ask you what the probability it is that it comes up heads, well, you naturally say 50%. If I look at it after flipping and ask you what your probability is now that the outcome's already determined, you'll probably grudgingly stick with 50%, even though the coin is flipped and the answer is, the outcome's already happened. You just don't know the answer. And this is actually one of the things I like about Bayesian reasoning. It gives us a method to continuously update our expectations about the world, our understanding of the world with new data. I think this is particularly useful for making judgments about a system under test as we build up evidence over time through a series of subsystem tests or build-up tests. And so here's a good example of that. I've easily used this approach now at more than a dozen safety review and test acceptance boards. So here are my notes from a particular tab. This was a weapons test from last year. And you can see you can do a lot of productive reasoning on the back of a piece of scratch paper during a meeting. A variety of programmatic reasons, a number of normal risk reduction and the build-up tests. You can see these things that are blanks are tests that weren't done. I still listed them as possible data, but I didn't assign a Bayes factor to them. And this actually let me assess how much additional weight those tests or analysis would provide to the answer. Starting with a fairly generous 1 to 100 prior odds of a safe test, the posterior odds ratio with all of these Bayes factors only amounted to, so there's my my prior 1 to 100 odds. If I add up multiply all these Bayes factors together, I get an overall Bayes factor of 32, and I end up with about a posterior odds ratio of 1 to 3, which corresponds to a probability of safe test of only 25%. At least that was my judgment after sitting through the test acceptance board. So this naturally led to me requesting additional analysis and further consulting with some of the subject matter experts on both the system and this type of testing. And at a subsequent meeting, I added 2 new pieces of evidence, 2 new pieces of data, Seek Eagle's judgment, and then some analysis on post-separation control authority of the system under test. And with each of these 2 new pieces of evidence, I ultimately came up to a 2 to 1 posterior odds ratio, or a probability of safe test of 66%. And I approved the test. It's interesting. In this case, we know how the story ends. On this project, the first launch was not successful, but it was not unsafe. The second attempt, following additional work and some additional buildup, was successful. So at least in this one example, our Bayesian reasoning was consistent with the outcome. I've multiple more examples that I could share, but the details wouldn't add any more additional insight to the approach than what we've already covered. I will, however, share one more specific example that I hope you'll find interesting. Most of you are likely familiar with the Monty Hall problem. This is a classic from your undergraduate probability class that shows how our gut instinct is sometimes unreliable. It went viral in 1990 when Marilyn Boss-Savant shared it in a column in Parade magazine. The column received thousands of letters from readers who disagreed with her answer. Many of the letters were from PhDs. Some of them were unfortunately quite sexist. It's a rather amusing tale of hubris if you haven't heard it before, but here's the description of the Monty Hall problem as described by Fox.
Is called the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of the game show that made it famous. You see, the problem goes like this. There's a brand new car behind one of 3 doors. Behind the other 2 are goats. Say you pick door number 1. Monty then shows you the goat behind one of the doors you didn't choose, say door number 3. Now, here's the question. You're allowed to change your answer to door 2. Do you switch?
Do you switch? The answer, if you know it, is, of course, yes. You originally had a 1/3 chance of being right with door number 1. Monty's reveal of the goat behind door number 3 doesn't change your chance of being right with door number 1. That means you can double your chance of winning by switching to door number 2, which now has a 2/3 chance of having the car after Monty revealed the goat. So let's evaluate this using Bayes factors. We will call H2 the hypothesis that the door is behind, or that the car is behind door number 2. The prior probability that the door 2 has the car is 1/3. So the prior odds are 1 to 2. Our data is the goat behind door number 3. Our Bayes factor is the ratio of the probability of seeing goat 3 given H2 to the probability of goat 3 given not H2. There are 3 possible outcomes to the game. We've selected door number 1. The probability of observing the goat behind door number 3 under the assumption of H2, i.e. the car behind door number 2, is 1. It's the only thing Monty can show us. The probability of observing the data under the assumption of not H2 is 1/4, giving us an overall Bayes factor of 4. So our posterior odds are 2 to 1, giving us a posterior probability of 2/3 if we switch to door number 2. Now this is where things get really interesting. You can account for other things as well. For example, let's say that through you're a loyal watcher of Let's Make a Deal, and through repeated observation, you know that the car is more often behind door number 1. Or maybe you know that the producers do a poor job of randomizing doors. And so they never repeat the same door as last week's. And you knew what last week's door was. Or maybe Monty Hall knows about the solution to the Monty Hall problem. And he only offers you the chance to switch if you've selected the correct door. And so he's trying to double down by offering you cash instead to make your switch. These are all subjective judgments about the real world. And with this additional information or what you think you know, you can adjust your Bayes factors with this additional evidence in each additional piece of data. But importantly, you're doing so in a systematic way. It accounts for the relative importance of different pieces of evidence that you have. And this technique, it may help guard us against humans' tendency towards confirmation bias. Uncertainty is a fact of life. Test is the exploration of uncertainty, ad and explorata. We are professional risk managers. We should strive to approach the unknown with intellectual humility and good judgment. I found that reasoning with Bayes factors to be helpful. It helps in navigating uncertainty. It helps put confidence intervals on the limits of what we know and what we don't know. I found it helpful in incorporating new evidence and new data, new subsystem tests, new build-up tests. It's helped to structure safety reviews. It can remove emotion from individual positions that people may stake out at a safety review board or a technical review board. So I plan to make a future video that will walk through the derivation and the math behind Bayes factors. I'll also provide more examples of techniques that we've used for setting some of our priors, for calculating likelihood ratios, and for updating beliefs with data. I would like to leave you with a thought, though, from John Stuart Mills. There is no such thing as absolute certainty, but there is assurance sufficient for the purposes of human life. And I like to think that Bayesian inference helps us with that assurance. Good luck, testers.